October 22, 1983. Two guards lay dead inside one of America's most secure prisons. The killers weren't escaping. They weren't even trying to run. Instead, they struck from inside the very heart of the system, exposing cracks so deep that the entire U.S. prison philosophy would be rewritten. From those blood-stained corridors at Marion would rise a fortress unlike any other. ADX Florence, the Alcatraz of the Rockies. This is the story of how two murders changed American corrections forever. On the morning of October 26, 1983, the United States Penitentiary at Marion, Illinois, carried the kind of tension that hung like fog. Marion was, at that time, the most secure federal prison in the United States, intended to be the replacement for the shuttered Alcatraz. It held some of the most notorious, violent, and unmanageable inmates in the entire Bureau of Prisons. Yet, that day would reveal just how fragile maximum security really was. Correctional Officer Merle Clutts was no rookie. He had worked at Marion long enough to understand its dangers. He knew the faces, the reputations, and the grudges of the inmates. Among them was Thomas Silverstein, a member of the Aryan Brotherhood prison gang. Silverstein was already infamous for his willingness to kill inside prison walls. He had been implicated in prior inmate murders and carried a reputation that made even hardened convicts tread carefully. But Clutts, by all accounts, was professional and steady, a man doing his job. That morning, Silverstein was being escorted from the shower back to his cell. It should have been routine, but the routine at Marion was broken. Somewhere in the chain of procedure, accounts vary to this day, Silverstein managed to free himself from restraints or at least loosen them enough to act. According to official reports later cited in court documents, he somehow gained access to a hidden weapon, a sharpened homemade knife, fashioned from metal and honed into a deadly shank. As Officer Clutts walked with Silverstein, the prisoner lunged. In seconds, Silverstein attacked with brutal precision, stabbing repeatedly. It was not a quick altercation. It was an assassination inside the walls of the most secure prison America had. Clutts was overwhelmed before backup could intervene. The control and dominance Silverstein displayed sent shockwaves throughout the cell block. When it was over, Clutts lay fatally wounded. The Aryan Brotherhood, through one man's act, had struck directly at the authority of the U.S. Bureau of Prisons. If that had been the end of the violence, it would already have been catastrophic. But Marion was not finished bleeding that day. Just hours later, another officer, Robert L. Hoffman, encountered inmate Clayton Fountain, himself a violent and dangerous man, also linked to the Aryan Brotherhood. Fountain had his own grievances, his own motivations to lash out. He armed himself with a deadly shank. Like Silverstein, Fountain did not hesitate. In a separate incident, eerily close in timing to the first, Fountain attacked and murdered Officer Hoffman. 2 guards, 2 killings in the same prison within the same day. To prison administrators, lawmakers, and the American public, the implications were staggering. The very facility meant to replace Alcatraz and embody maximum security had suffered a double murder of staff in a matter of hours. The Bureau of Prisons could no longer claim that even their toughest penitentiary could keep officers safe or prevent gang-driven violence from dictating life behind the walls. In the aftermath, chaos rippled through Marion. Staff morale plummeted. Inmates sensed the shifts in power dynamics. The Bureau of Prisons had no choice but to act. Within days, Marion was placed under a form of lockdown so strict it would redefine American corrections. Prisoners confined to their cells for 23 or even 24 hours a day. All movement tightly controlled, interaction nearly eliminated. This became known as the control unit model, a prototype of permanent lockdown. But to Bureau of Prisons Director Norman Carlson, the killings at Marion proved something more than the need for temporary lockdown. They proved that the United States needed a new kind of prison, one designed from the ground up to prevent exactly this kind of catastrophe. Not a maximum security prison, but a supermaximum. A place where the most dangerous men in America could be completely isolated, stripped of opportunity to coordinate, strike, or manipulate weaknesses in the system. The seeds of ADX Florence were planted in blood at Marion. The 2 murders became the inflection point, the undeniable justification for a prison unlike any other, one that would embody total control through architecture, technology, and philosophy. A prison built not simply to punish, but to contain human beings deemed too dangerous to exist anywhere else. As news of the murders reached Washington, the Bureau of Prisons prepared for a reckoning. Congressional hearings, media scrutiny, and families of the slain officers demanded answers. The U.S. had to admit, if Marion could fail, then the system itself was vulnerable. The question was no longer, how do we repair Marion? It was, what will we build next? The killings of Officers Merle Clutts and Robert Hoffman shook the Bureau of Prisons to its core. For the families, it was a devastating personal tragedy. For the federal system, it was an existential crisis. If staff could not be protected in Marion, the most fortified penitentiary in the country at the time, then where could they be safe? In the immediate aftermath, the Bureau of Prisons had to act swiftly. The decision was blunt, controversial, and transformative. A permanent lockdown. Beginning in late October 1983, the prison administration ordered that all inmates at Marion would be confined to their cells 23 hours a day, 7 days a week. The lockdown was no longer a short-term disciplinary tool. It became the foundation of how Marion would function. The control unit experiment, this strict regime became known as the control unit model. It was not just about locking men in cells, it was about re-engineering prison life to eliminate vulnerability. Inmates could no longer congregate in the yard, eat together in mess halls, or move in groups through corridors. Instead, nearly every aspect of daily life was brought to the cell. Meals delivered directly to doors, showers controlled on strict schedules, and interactions kept to the bare minimum. The message from the Bureau was clear. The days of gangs running operations inside Marion were over. But critics were quick to notice that this wasn't a temporary measure. It was indefinite. For the hundreds of men locked inside, the prison was transformed overnight into a pressure cooker of solitary confinement. Prison reform advocates sounded alarms, arguing that this amounted to psychological torture. Even some staff members admitted the prison felt more like an armed warehouse for humans than a correctional institution. Yet the Bureau insisted, safety had to come first. The families of the murdered officers demanded nothing less. Marion as a symbol. Throughout the 1980s, Marion operated under this model. It became a symbol in American corrections, both of toughness and of controversy. Supporters called it necessary, the only way to manage inmates like Thomas Silverstein and Clayton Fountain, men who had proven they could kill even in the most controlled environments. Opponents, including organizations like Amnesty International, denounced Marion as a violation of human rights, pointing to prolonged isolation, sensory deprivation, and psychological breakdowns among inmates. Still, the Bureau of Prisons did not back down. Marion was no longer just a penitentiary. It was a laboratory for a new way of thinking about incarceration. If traditional maximum security prisons could not contain the worst of the worst, then perhaps the solution was to design institutions where escape, coordination, and violence were simply impossible. Norman Carlson's vision. At the center of this philosophy was Norman Carlson, then the director of the Bureau of Prisons. Carlson had been a career administrator who believed deeply in the mission of federal corrections. The events at Marion convinced him of one thing: the United States needed a facility purpose-built for total control. Carlson defended the control unit publicly. In testimony before Congress, he argued that Marion's permanent lockdown was not cruel, but necessary. He described inmates like Silverstein and Fountain as irredeemably violent, individuals who could never safely be placed in general population. For Carlson, these men weren't just inmates, they were walking time bombs. But Carlson's vision didn't stop with Marion. He saw Marion as a stopgap, a patched-up solution to a deeper flaw. The real answer, he argued, was to design a prison from the ground up, where the mistakes of Marion could never be repeated. A place where architecture itself would enforce discipline, where the possibility of surprise attack or coordinated gang violence would be engineered out of existence. The blueprint for Supermax. By the late 1980s, discussions within the Bureau of Prisons began to shift toward a radical idea: the creation of a new kind of prison, beyond maximum security. This facility would not be about rehabilitation or even traditional punishment. It would be about absolute containment. At Marion, officers had to escort inmates through showers, hallways, and recreation yards. Each of these movements created windows of opportunity for attack. At the new facility, movements would be minimal, controlled by remote electronic doors. At Marion, inmates could still communicate through corridors and even influence other cell blocks. At the new facility, design would ensure near-total isolation. The concept became known as Supermax, short for Super Maximum Security. The term itself captured the philosophy, not just higher fences or more guards, but a completely new level of incarceration. Public scrutiny. The debate was not confined to prison walls. The American public, already alarmed by rising crime rates and violent prison gangs, began to accept the idea that some individuals simply could not be housed in ordinary prisons. News media covered the Marion murders as proof that prison gangs like the Aryan Brotherhood posed a threat not just to other inmates, but to the staff sworn to guard them. Civil liberties groups continued to push back, warning that the control unit model was spreading a dangerous precedent. If Marion could justify permanent lockdown, what would stop other prisons from adopting the same system? Yet, for the Bureau of Prisons, the argument always returned to the same point. 2 officers had been murdered in cold blood inside the most secure facility in the country. If that could happen there, it could happen anywhere. And so, as the 1980s ended and the 1990s began, the groundwork was being laid. The control unit at Marion was both a warning and a blueprint. The next step would not be a policy change inside an old penitentiary. It would be a brand new fortress carved into the Colorado mountains. By the early 1990s, the Bureau of Prisons was ready to act on Norman Carlson's vision. The site chosen was Florence, Colorado, a remote stretch of desert at the foot of the Rocky Mountains. Far from major cities, Florence offered seclusion and land, the perfect canvas for a fortress. Construction began in the early 1990s, backed by federal funding and justified by the rising tide of prison violence across the country. When it opened in January 1995, the facility was unlike anything America had ever seen. ADX Florence was designed with near-total isolation in mind. Electronically controlled steel doors, cells built of reinforced concrete, limited natural light, and inmates confined for 23 hours a day. Even the recreation yards were single-man cages. Marion had been improvised into a control unit. Florence was born as one. Every detail, from sight lines to ventilation, was engineered to prevent another Clutts or Hoffman tragedy. For the Bureau of Prisons, it was the solution. For critics, it was the embodiment of cruelty. But for better or worse, ADX became the Alcatraz of the Rockies, housing terrorists, cartel leaders, and gang bosses who once controlled violence inside prison walls. 2 murders at Marion rewrote the blueprint for incarceration in America. From that day forward, the debate shifted, not about rehabilitation, but about containment. ADX Florence stands as the legacy of those blood-soaked hours in 1983, a prison built not for second chances, but for absolute control. The question that lingers is one America still wrestles with today. When safety and humanity collide behind bars, which one do we choose?